Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue et merci. On va avoir la conversation aujourd'hui en anglais, donc je vais juste faire une brève présentation en français et s'il y a des questions après ou même pendant, je peux faire des traductions si vous voulez. En tout cas, il y a Rhiannon Vogel, une commissaire qui travaille en ce moment au National Gallery, à la Galerie nationale du Canada, l'écrivain et collectionneur Bill Clark de Toronto, et Mika Walsh, l'éditrice du revue Border Crossings à Winnipeg. On va avoir une conversation sur le sujet des artistes qui travaillent sur papier dans le reste du Canada qui peuvent nous intéresser à Montréal. So I'll switch to English now, if that's okay. And I think we're going to start with Mika. And Mika, there's a microphone there. If you...
And it's on? Is it on?
Is it on? I'm Ben Klein,
it's on. Okay.
by the way.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I thought I would start with some facts about Winnipeg.
Mika? I think she says you need to speak in. Please continue.
What?
She says you need to speak into the microphone. Nobody can hear.
I'm speaking into the microphone and no one can hear? Goes this way? Like this? Okay. Once more. Some facts about Winnipeg. For starters, everyone still remembers and talks about the general 1919 workers' strike. Something else that you should know about Winnipeg is that the father of the province was Louis Riel, and he was hanged for treason. Winnipeg is in the geographic center of Canada, right in the middle of things, and we still feel like outsiders. My theory is that this has created an interesting psychic and geographic hybrid, the centrally located eccentric. The winters are cold, people work inside, they gather together to work collectively to keep each other warm. The art that's produced isn't conceptual, it's made and it's material. Often it's narrative. There's a strong tradition of storytelling and a locally generated and sustained mythology. I wanted to tell you something, or just give you a list of some of the people who produce art in Winnipeg. The serious art makers are iconoclasts, and their work is highly individual. Think of the following short list: Eleanor Bond, Wanda Coop, William Eakin, David McMillan, Sarah Ann Johnson, Carl Funk, Marcel Zama, Michael Dumontier, Rodney Latourelle, Paul Butler, Neil Farber, Daniel Barrow, Kent Monkman, Guy Madden, Simon Hughes, Paul Robles, Aganitha Dick, and the artists whose work I've brought to show you: Erica Ayres, Ted Barker, Elaine Stockey, Derek Dunlop, Gordon Peterson, and Sky Globush. It's the hermetic long winters and limited resources, but above all, the very smart and well-informed, highly critical and rigorous reception by peers that defines art making in Winnipeg. So now I'll tell you a little bit about each of the artists whose work you're going to see. I have the benefit of a lovely assistant. Robert Enright is going to be operating the gap between the images so that what I'm saying corresponds to what you're seeing. So the first artist, and most of these artists are young, that I wanted to show you is a young man named Ted Barker. He graduated from the University of Manitoba School of Art in 2007, and his medium is primarily drawing, although he's done some very fine paintings in oil on gessoed wood panel. His subject is loosely autobiographical in that he's using himself as a form for portraiture, but the portraits he's painting are his own, but through his grandfather, who emigrated to Canada from the Netherlands after the war. And he brought with him and found here, and here I'm meaning in the area of Winnipeg, a mythology of the North, which he inhabited in a version of the gray owl construct. His invented romantic affiliations with the North have been extended by Ted literally in his putting on his opa's deerskin jacket, and less directly in wrapping himself in the material traces he finds in and around the cabin his grandfather built. scraps of lumber, a tarpaulin from cabin renovations, old snowshoes and ropes or dressings that he drapes on his own lean form. He acknowledges other sources in this project, these more painterly. The wrapped heads of Ivan Eyre, who taught at the School of Art generations before Ted studied there, but whose influence as a master draftsman still prevails, and Carl Funk's meticulous Parka portraits with the face always occluded. He shows here at La Roche-Jonques. And most of the works are oil on graphite or ink on paper, and a few of the last pieces you saw were oil painting on panel. This is Elaine Stocky. Elaine Stocky graduated from the University of Manitoba. She's a photographer with a degree in fine arts and completed her MFA at Yale in 2009. Her first degree, however, was in chemistry, which I think accounts for her meticulous printing and the Merlin-esque alchemy of her images. Her photographs look like no one else's. Narrative doesn't interest her, but emotional complexity does. So while you can make no linear sense of what's taking place in the photographs, the players, the subjects are engaged and present. Elaine Stocky is interested in issues of the real and the constructed or the discussed nature of truth and fiction in photography. She's advertised for actors and models for her photo sets, making clear that what she wants is not some idea of physical beauty, but ordinary people with their attendant awkwardness and flaws, selecting them on the basis of a rich emotional and physical possibilities. The language she engages is a visual code of her own, and the work is often difficult to locate in time. The sites she chooses are ambiguous. Was the photo taken now or maybe in the 50s? The dress gives no clues. Her interest no longer in use theater, outdoor wrestling ring, spotty walls, heavily varnished wood panels can be anywhere, anytime. And her use of heavy shadows, almost as characters, in many of the images extends the plane and the time of the photos. Obscure, haunting, and otherworldly. The work is introspective and therefore personal, wonderfully eccentric, and resolutely individual. A lot of these, the ones with high color, are hand-tinted gelatin silver prints. Derek Dunlop did his undergraduate degree at Simon Fraser and his MFA at UBC. Now he lives in Winnipeg, which is where he was from, and he's the director of operations at Platform Center for Photographic and Digital Art. His work has just been included in an exhibition at the Drawing Center in New York, so he's a committed drawer. And it was his drawing that was chosen for the invitation card. And in July, he'll show there again. With his current drawings, what he's considering is the accidental and the intentional and the materiality of mark making. This is well illustrated in the very subtle series Carbon Paper, 2011 to 2014. It's so subtle from where I am, I almost can't see it, but I think you probably can. Where he's using carbon paper as the medium rather than the outmoded form of reproduction or replication that it is. Here he's tracing drawings, either created or found on his computer using his mouse. The thin sheet of carbon paper is the interface between his hand and the drawing paper, though certainly minimal in figuration. Their formal nature is undercut by the fragile, accidental smudges, the blurs and imprints and impressions his fingers inadvertently leave as he produces the drawings. The direct results are unplanned. That they are there is not. The last two that you saw there, those are pastel on found paper. The others are the carbon drawings, the earlier ones. Erica Ayres received her undergraduate degree from the University of Manitoba and her MFA from the Glasgow School of Art in 2007. All of these are graphite on paper, some as large as 42 by 58. So these are very large drawings, and these are all graphite on paper. She lives in Glasgow and shows her work in the UK, Europe, and New York. She works in video and has produced haunting, drastically funny, and unnerving short performances in which she has been the lead character. Now the work is becoming increasingly complex, with larger casts and longer pieces still rife with destabilizing storylines and highly unexpected casting. She also makes sculptures and startling drawings in graphite and ballpoint ink. All her work is narrative. She acknowledges that her aesthetic sensibility draws heavily on low-budget television dramas, She describes the plots as autobiographical, but with significant character shifts. In her videos, the narrator often confides or insinuates a personal biography, which Erica identifies as the estranged voice, allowing her to successfully suggest the improbable and off-putting stories that the images relay. In the guise of self-revelation, her characters have license to be clumsy, vulnerable, ridiculous, and inappropriate. Viewing leaves you dizzy with a swing between revulsion and compassion, ridicule and empathy. In her graphite and ink drawings, the portraits, at first looking, seem realistic and accurate, but the proportions are just sufficiently skewed to cause a visual disturbance, and the subjects not quite sufficiently attractive, not quite pin-up pretty. And then the question of who is flawed, the subject or the representation. Ayres is always asking, what is it we're looking at and what is it we're seeing? And further to the notion of eccentricity, this is her newest work. She sent it to me to see if I was interested, and I am. These are hand-cast, hand-sculpted ceramic hair pieces.
Mika, may I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I often find that artwork from Winnipeg has a through line that involves a visible, emotional, vulnerable, a kind of a vulnerability. Do you think that's true? And
Yeah, I think so. I think that there we are on the prairies, quite exposed. So yes, I think the vulnerability is geographically induced, and it's a small population, and there's a good degree of candor in Winnipeg, and so people they put everything out there, and that does make them vulnerable. Us, not them.
Sorry?
It makes us vulnerable. Yes.
I mean, it's not that that emotional vulnerability is something that you only find in artwork from Winnipeg, but there is a certain stylistic impulse in Winnipeg that goes across media, I find, and across types of just every kind of art production. I mean, even in the ones that you wouldn't expect to find it because it's more formal kind of work, or it's work maybe by a very confident or brash-seeming artist. There's always or almost always, something sort of lurking, a childlike sort of feeling underneath the surface.
Yeah, I would say that the artists are really are unguarded. It's not an uncanny bunch. I mean, in an unaware sense, they're a canny group, but there is a willingness to be very direct and therefore vulnerable.
Thanks.
Shall I finish up with
Please,
it? Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Just a couple more. There's Gordon Peterson. Gordon studied architecture in the University of Manitoba, but his practice is in painting and drawing. His most recent exhibition was at Diaz Contemporary in 2013. His small works on paper, only 6 by 8 inches, hold a space larger than the dimensions of the sheet on which he draws. They're dense and rich and assertive, as interesting and full as a tableau painting describing an historic battle. They could be small maps with directions and instructions that would seem referential if you knew where you were setting out from. And while not working drawings for paintings to follow, he has described them as work that helped inform the direction of the paintings that did come after. You can understand the sequential or linear process, that is the way he works, when you understand the manufacture of a group of paintings from 2009 to 2012. He looked at a number of the paintings he'd produced when he first moved to Toronto from Winnipeg, and they seemed to him incomplete, fragmentary, and unresolved. But they were themselves a map, and he proceeded to follow the informational instructions on their surfaces. He used them as underpaintings, working over and across their surfaces by way of understanding how they were incomplete, reading a kind of painterly braille on the face of the canvas. The new paintings took instructions from the work they were covering or recovering. So what he was doing with these works was doubling or mirroring his own work, thoroughly engaging and looking beyond the parameters of surface, material, and process. The callback or echo of one work was transcribed on a new surface, new and also personally historic. The new old work suggested ghosted traces, but the substance, though dreamy and almost hallucinatory, is real and bears a form of pentimento characteristic of drawing. Well, that's the end of the... Those paintings are the pairs that are referential, one over the other and one to the other. And the last artist I wanted to talk about was Sky Glabush. Sky was born in BC and he lives and teaches in London, Ontario, but I see him as a prairie artist and an ex officio Winnipegger because for many years he lived in Saskatchewan, which is where I met him, and because he has close, ongoing, and personal affiliations with Winnipeg. So far as I'm concerned, he's one of us. So I'm including him. And also his most recent exhibition display, which just concluded at MKG 127, was a show he described as all drawings. So he fits here. When he talked to me about the work just as the exhibition was opening, he described the title piece display, a 7-foot-long graphite drawing, as the grain of sand in the oyster, the provocation and opening point of tension for the rest of the work. Ink, graphite, plaster, collage on paper are the materials of the exhibition. The work's argument and the subject is his struggle with the dialectical pull in the conversation between the sacred and the secular, and its reductive language. It's that, along with his reluctance to have one isolated from the other, as the impetus for making work. He says modernism is the language of his exhibition, and modernism's pull to the secular remains the struggle he experiences in his desire to have materiality become the subject. At the same time, he wants the conversation to include not only formalism's focus on material, but also on aspects of the driving spirituality which he asserts is inherent in all art making. Out of this has come an amazing body of work, display, a few of which you're seeing here.
While we're on the subject of Sky Glabush, I believe he has some work in MKG's
Michael
booth
Klein, yeah,
over
he
there
does.
right now. There's some beautiful pieces.
Not from this body of work, but the previous exhibition.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
How about some of the other artists that you were just showing us? Are any of them to be found here?
Well, Ted Barker is LaRoche Jonkas, and I don't know if Diaz is here, but that's where Gord Peterson is. Probably not so much. My intention was to bring artists that may not be known here.
Of course. Well, that's good. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? Okay. Well, should we continue? Bill, are you ready to? Thanks.
So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you to ADAC for having us here today. I thought I had printed out all my notes, but they're the wrong notes. So Gmail, I hate Gmail. I find it a baffling program. So I'm going to have to wing it a little bit here. I'll tell you actually a little bit about myself, since I was invited here as a collector, and I collect primarily works on paper. I'm glad to have Winnipeg here because the Royal Art Lodge can be thanked for making me into a collector. Their work was some of the first stuff that I ever bought, and after seeing the show Ask the Dust that was at the power plant and it toured, and it was one of those. I also worked at Canadian Art Magazine for about a year, and so I was just constantly seeing like all this amazing work coming across my desk and in slide format, like in actual slides. That's how long ago it was, and eventually, that was kind of why I wanted to start collecting, just because I saw so much that was just so amazing, and so it kind of started with paper, and it's always been paper for affordability reasons and for practical reasons. Like it's easily stored, it's more affordable to frame, and as we see at a fair like this, there's such a diversity of what can be done in the medium. So I brought 3 artists from Toronto, all at slightly different stages of their careers. The first one here you see, and I think they're all, again, we were talking a bit about modernism, and I think Rhiannon is going to talk a bit more about this trend that I think all 3 of us kind of saw individually, actually in each of our cities. So this must be a Canada-wide thing in which younger artists are re-examining the legacy of modernism, I think. So this first artist I brought is Georgia Dickey. She shows at Cooper Cole in Toronto. She's young. She's in her 20s. She may be 25, maybe. I've got a couple of collage works. She uses vintage papers and then paints, cuts, and usually her exhibitions include a suite of collage works and then sculpture. And the third piece, I wish I could tell you the titles of everything, but they are in my notes, unfortunately. So, but her sculpture again, she creates all her sculptures and her collage using found materials and vintage kind of materials. The next artist I brought is Derek Liddington. He shows at Dan Faria in Toronto. Again, his works on paper, they're graphite drawings. He usually has some sort of there's always some very complicated backstory to almost all of his drawings. And they either relate to some sort of either history going back to the Russian he's made drawings based on everything from the Russian Revolution to the death of Kurt Cobain. So so very, very wide reference points for him, and but I think you can really kind of see, especially in these drawings, the influence of Russian constructivism and that sort of history. He also often incorporates sculpture and a performative element into a lot of his installations as well. At his not his last, but his previous show at Dan Faria's, he had a ballerina spinning endlessly, doing pirouettes for a good 20 minutes during a performance. A real ballerina doing pirouettes for about 20 minutes, just nonstop. I don't know how she did it. I was ready to pass out for her. But again, I think in Toronto, I think you see a real dedication to technique and precision in the drawing, especially.
Bill, is it okay if I cut and ask you a question?
Yeah, interrupt me anytime.
Well, maybe
Great.
maybe we could have a characterization of contemporary practice in Toronto as you go along to make it a bit more general as well.
Well, I thought of that question, and it's kind of difficult to say because Toronto's a big place, and so there's a lot of different work being done. You have everything from figurative painting and drawing and sculpture right through to really minimalist, collage we saw earlier. So I don't really think you can really pin down exactly what makes art in Toronto, other than I think, like I said, there's a real dedication to precision and getting it just right. I think. I don't know whether it's because it is, Canada's largest center, so there's a lot of competition, and so you always have to kind of, artists have to step their game up all the time. So maybe there's this. But yeah, I kind of get the sense that artists are very considered in everything they do and how the exhibition is going to look. From start to finish, artists in Toronto especially seem to.
You mean more than elsewhere?
So I can only comment on Toronto, but that's just the sense that I get from artists in Toronto, is that kind of from start to finish they, are very, very involved in every aspect of producing the work right through to how it is going to be displayed. So
is that an installation concern from a practice perspective, or is it something else?
I think from everything. In an installation perspective, yes. But even if somebody was going to hang a room of drawings, there's a very I always get the sense of walking in and feeling like it's a very considered. They haven't just been kind of randomly put up. There's even in when you're looking at Derek's drawings, if you saw a suite of them in the gallery, you'd feel like there's some sense of narrative going on, and you're following it through, even if the narrative is just like being conveyed by a repeating shape moving around the suite of drawings that you're seeing, and so the narrative is your eye is following it or something, and you kind of see that, I think, in at Catherine Mulheron's booth. Balint Zacco has a literal kind of narrative line visually through, like, if you look at how the drawings are all, the watercolors are all like lined up. There's a line going all the way through all of the works that tie them all together. It's really, really interesting. So, but yeah, with hands reaching across like frames and that sort of thing. But I just feel like there's a real sense of rigor to everything that Toronto artists do. And also, thinking on it too, I feel like there's a lot of process-based work in Toronto as well, and a real materiality. There's a number of artists who just work and work and work surfaces of sculptures, and working with kind of unconventional materials that they transform into something else. Like there's another artist at Dan Fria, Jennifer Rose Scarino, who works in sculpture, and she will take a regular piece of aluminum siding and we'll just work it with other materials, and it just transforms it into something else. So I think there's a real dedication to technique, and a real dedication to like process, I think, in a lot of work in Toronto. So there's Toronto artists here that could be completely disagreeing with me right now. I don't know. We'll see. But that's kind of what I've perceived.
It's a perspective.
So yes, that's and the thing is too, I'm also just kind of talking from what I know and what interests me, obviously, and I'm really interested in seeing the artist's hand in the work.
I agree. For what it's worth, I think finish
yeah.
in Toronto is a major concern.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's why I'm attracted to collage and drawing and works on paper, because they're intimate, and the artist has had to like really engage with making this sort of work. Whereas maybe a larger installation or something that's manufactured, it's the artist's idea, but the artist has maybe passed the fabrication on to somebody more skilled or a specialist in that sort of thing, or that's why I really enjoy this type of work myself. So,
can I ask how you think the process element does it generate content for the sort of formal side of things, or is it a separate thing?
Gosh, that's a question. Jeepers.
Too much?
Yeah, that might be a bit much for almost 4:30 in the afternoon. So I would say that yes, perhaps sometimes the process is perhaps what the work is about.
Yeah, right.
And
exactly.
and yes, that definitely interests me. I love to know how a work is made, or how an artist has kind of come to how a work has kind of like come to look like how it looks, or how the installation has kind of come to how it look. I'd love to hear that backstory. Some people don't want to know. I want to know. I love that sort of thing. And
definitely in Jennifer's sculptures at Dan Fria that you were just mentioning, for example. I mean, it's
real hands-on work.
Yeah, and I don't think she would ever say that it was purely formal. It's about the looking experience of the finish, but it's very much also about what went into it.
About how she gets it to this point where you're not quite sure what you're looking at, because you look at the materials and you're saying it doesn't look like aluminum. Like it's really interesting. So, yeah. And then the third, can I move on to the third? Is that all right? Okay. And then the third person I brought, his name is Jacob Robert Wibley, and he shows at Narwhal Projects in Toronto. And again, I think you can kind of see the similarities with the other works as far as like visually. He makes his collage out of, again, old papers. None of the papers are post-1960, I believe, that he uses for the collage. So this is an earlier work, and then going through the other two, this is a collage work on an old book cover. And then the final one is he's, in his most recent work, he's kind of taken a step back and he's trying to be a bit more minimal in what he's doing. You may have also noticed that there's a lot of circles in what I presented, and I love circles. I don't know why. It's just a shape that if you see my collection, you'll be like, there's a lot of circles in everything. I don't know. Maybe it's like a wholeness type of a unity wholeness type of thing. So, but those are none of these artists or their galleries are at the fair, but there's some homework for you.
I think it's a good thing that we're hearing about all these artists that
Yes.
we can't see right now.
Yeah,
because we need to hear about them sometimes.
Well, there are a number of artists here who are some of my favorites at the fair. There's from at Le Gallery, Luc Painter. His work is incredible. Again, he's referencing the history of modernism as well, but through kind of a 1980s lens. So it's kind of like this watered down, tweaked kind of strange
he might
version
be here.
of
We might be
modernism.
able to even ask him a question.
Exactly,
About that.
I think he is. So
Maybe-
he's
maybe,
there.
yeah.
He's there. He didn't throw anything at me. So I was going like, oh my God, shut up. Something works about. His work is here and it's really, really fantastic. I mentioned Balanzaco. His work is really great. Jim Verberg, his work is at Nicolas Robert, and he also has a show on at the gallery right now. And his work, I haven't seen.
There's a beautiful show in the Belgo on the 5th floor of Jim.
Yeah, at the Belgo building, and his work is. I haven't seen the new body of work yet, so I'm expecting something a bit different from talking to him. So, but previous work I've seen just beautifully blends like a kind of what feels like a very personal story with abstraction. Like it's really, really interesting the way he's kind of like mixed these two things together and created a narrative as you kind of walk around the gallery in passings I've seen. So yeah, there's a number of some people I really, really like here. So it's good to see.
Can we go back just for 1 second, Bill? Because I know you were saying that you think that collage is a major issue, maybe even across the country right now.
I think so. I feel
of-
like there's a number of artists working in collage in a whole bunch of different ways. You've got like Elizabeth Vonar out in Vancouver. You've got Luc Paradis here in Montreal. There's like these Paul Butler in Winnipeg. That's right. Yes. Who's got a show on in Toronto at Division right now. I'm wondering whether it's because we're living in a very fast-paced, cut and paste world, and whether this return to a very, very traditional medium, even if they're doing it digitally, is some sort of like comment on maybe it's time for us to slow down and consider things and look more closely at things and that, maybe that's where it's coming from. But yeah, collage seems to be like a kind of significant trend in art right now for me, I think. But
Do you think there's a stylistic tendency across the board?
no, I feel like I feel like anything goes. Like you look at Jacob's work, and this is a collage, but if you put it beside Elizabeth Vonar, her stuff is completely digital. They're coming from two completely different places. It's still collage. Her work is coming from it very much like the internet and fashion and design and that sort of thing. Whereas Jacob's work is like really, really steeped in history and materials.
It could be a conceptual collage as well.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I think it's a very broad medium, like in which to work. Like, there's a lot that can be done with it. But yeah, I kind of feel like there's something in the air that people just want to like bring things all together that are maybe perhaps being bombarded and just kind of focusing them on something or in some way or organizing that sort of thing. So
Great.
yeah. So.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any questions for Bill right now before we move on? Are you ready, Rihanna? Great. Please go ahead.
Oh yes, of course. Yes. Sorry, I'm hanging on to it like
Pass the mic.
like a life jacket.
It's a safety
right?
net. No, I think it's really interesting what you were saying. I was just scribbling notes as you both were talking, about the idea of slowing down, and the idea of really looking. And I think that it plays into the idea of collage. But for me, being interested in drawing specifically, I think it really plays into the idea of drawing as a way of kind of taking time to look again, to slow down, to create something has a material property, to work with our hands, and to really have a dedication to a technique and a process again. And I think that that's what I'm seeing a lot of. I actually brought work by 3 artists who have recently become part of the National Gallery's collection and who can all actually be seen here at the fair. And I thought that I would bring them, one, because they are all from a younger generation of artists that I'm specifically interested in. And as well, they kind of represent different trends that I think we've all kind of brought up in a number of ways. The idea of not necessarily narrative, maybe a return to a rigor, a process, again, a dedication to technique, and that idea of what the work is about. So I'm starting with work by Tristram Lansdowne, and these are the first 2 that you will see are pieces that have recently become part of the National Gallery collection and are actually on tour right now in an exhibition that I've curated of contemporary drawing that will be on view at the Art Gallery of Alberta in June, if anyone's out there. So what I was interested in with Tristram's work is really the way that his meticulous attention to craft and to detail. These are watercolor drawings on paper. And for me, when I first saw them, I was quite blown away by the attention to detail and to that idea of handwork and craft in his process. And as well, the way that he is able to fuse icons of 20th century modernism with present-day urban environments and lush botanical landscapes in these kind of acidic hybrid forms that are neither inhabited nor uninhabited. And I see them as kind of both utopian relics and dystopic kind of aftermaths of something that may or may not have happened. Tristram is someone who kind of engages also with this idea of the history of modernism, especially in architecture. And that's another thing that I've been seeing more and more, especially in contemporary work, this engagement or an interest in architecture and the architectural process.
May I just say that that sounds a lot like a description also of some of Eleanor Bond's work.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that, again, what I was interested in Tristram's work was really the way that he's part of a younger generation of artists who are maybe challenging the rapid pace of technological advancement, and really requiring creating work that requires a level of discipline and a return to studio practice, which I think is really interesting, not just like grabbing from everywhere, really kind of working as an artist, honing a craft.
Do we all agree that that is in fact happening and that is a major current preoccupation? I do too. The handmade.
Yeah. And then the next artist that I've brought along, I hope this slide looks better to you guys than it does to me. This is an artist named Howie Tsui, who has a really interesting background. He was born in Hong Kong, raised in Nigeria, then emigrated to Thunder Bay. He received an MFA at the University of Waterloo and lived for a time in Ottawa, which is where I met him, and has since relocated to Vancouver. So he is really an example of that kind of multicultural artist. And Howie is someone who I think has really, again, moved from maybe a more loose practice to a very meticulous practice of drawing. Again, that idea of honing his craft, but also honing his research practice. And he's someone who is highly interested in doing a lot of background research before he does his work. He melds references from Japanese manga, Hong Kong pop culture, Chinese and Japanese ghost tales, as well as traditional fables of horror and grotesque, and kind of revisits them in a way of looking at Asian scroll painting. So he's kind of gone back to look at how the masters may have created their scroll paintings and then reinterprets these into kind of hybrid hyper narratives that explore historical folklore and anecdotal tidbits. So this work is actually a departure for Howie. You can see some of his work at Le Gallery, and if you go to that booth, you'll see that his work in the past has been quite bright and more caricature-like. And in this work, which is called The Unfortunates of Darcy Island, which was completed in 2013, he really took on that task of recreating the traditional Asian scroll painting aesthetic, but has mixed it with a dark contemporary history. And since living in Vancouver, he's actually come to look more into recent Asian history in Canada. And this work actually references a rather horrific time in Victoria, where Asian immigrants were actually, several of them were discovered to have leprosy, and they were put in a colony basically on this island off the coast of Victoria and just left there.
When?
In 1891, so in the 19th century. So what he's interested in this work, again, is really kind of recreating a historical work, but using contemporary stories and ideas. Yeah, and I think with him, I really do see, if we can just go back for a second, yeah, I really do see in him the trend towards contemporary artists, again, re-looking at history and how those events may have come to affect a younger generation. So that's something I see in his work, and as well in someone like Sherry Boyle's work. And then the third artist I've chosen to talk about is Tammy Campbell. She's from Saskatoon. And I think that someone had mentioned the idea of process-based work and the material, and I think Tammy is someone who's a very exemplary of that. She creates works using masking tape to, in fact, engage with the legacies and myths of modernism, specifically those associated with Emma Lake, taking its formal and conceptual qualities as jumping-off points for her own paintings. She works in a serial fashion and creates geometric compositions of grids, squares, and circles that adhere to very specific sets of parameters and make reference to artists such as Frank Stella, Agnes Martin, Sola Witt, and Barnett Newman. While she pays homage to these predecessors, her works are also astute, if not almost at times playful undoings of their hard-edged austerity and epic qualities, a fact that speaks to her contemporary sensibilities and artistic wit. So the works that I've brought are kind of exemplary of her working practice, because as you start to look closer at Tammy's work, you start to see the flaws that she has actually let come to the fore, where the myth of modernism kind of starts to unravel in her work. And we can see that rather than masking off the areas in anticipation of actually maybe painting in the areas, she has meticulously crafted thin layers of acrylic paint into appliques that resemble tape itself. So these works are really double entendres. They're at once finished and unfinished, referential and self-referential, abstract, hyper-realist, earnest, and cheeky all at the same time. So I think that with Tammy, we again see an example of someone who's very interested in handwork and in rigor and working with the material. I'm done. Yeah.
I've got a few ones. I find that when you said Emma Lake, so in other words, you see her work, which makes perfect sense, as sort of filtering formalism through the prairie school of abstraction, where she, of course, still does live, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Okay.
Do you want me to
no,
say
yeah,
more?
1-0 for my
Okay.
question, yeah. the sense of there almost is a sense of humor, right? In those sort of weird little abstractions, they're mocking
Yeah, well, I think
on
that
their level.
in all three of the artists that I brought, I think that there is an idea of looking back on history, looking back at modernism, and I think that for a lot of younger artists, it's the idea of not ever having lived with the promise, the utopic promise of modernism. It was never part of I'll say our generation. We didn't grow up thinking that, modernism would save everyone, and if we just built the perfect city and everything was a straight line,
We grew up with the opposite, I guess.
our lives
right?
would be perfect. And I think that for artists of this generation to look back at modernism, what we're really seeing is you're seeing it through a lens of someone who's never had it be promised to them. So they can see it almost from a distance to say, okay, well, this is what it wanted to be, this is what it was, and what is it to me today? And I think that the humor, whether it's intended or just in a kind of irony, is just kind of a looking back and saying, hey, this is what it is to us now.
So you think it's a light humor, essentially, or
Depending on the artist. I mean, I think there are
well,
some
in her
that
case, for example.
Pardon me?
In her case, for
In
example.
her case, yeah. I mean, I think she's very astute and very smart and very. It's interesting because she's someone who, in and of herself, is very rigorous and meticulous and detailed and hard-edged. So she is at once kind of embodying all the things that those modernists actually sought, but at the same time turning it back on itself. So it just kind of goes in this circuitous loop that just, I think, is
Right.
really interesting.
I agree. The sort of dissociation of high seriousness from those qualities of precision and skill.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, at one point they may have seemed like they were this sort of synonymous and they had to go together. But obviously that's not the case.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting that she's a woman who's engaging with this kind of boys' club history, which, yeah, I find
Yes.
good. Yeah.
Any quit?
Sorry, I think I'm kind of seeing that too in Toronto, where, a lot of, young women are stepping up and working with very traditionally masculine materials, working with like concrete and metal and I don't know why. But it's just something that I think you see a lot because they can exactly. So, but I see there seems to be a lot of that happening in Toronto now as well, where like a lot of the material-based work is being made by women. So I don't know why I can't speak for them, but it seems like something that I'd noticed as well. So, yeah, just throwing that out there.
Well, it seems all of these sort of phenomena seem to be part of the look back at modernism as something that we need to do, and yet the alterations that seem necessary, inevitable, and it's the work of the future to amend the certainties of the way that the look of that kind of work used to be produced. Would you say?
Well, perhaps maybe more women artists are attracted to this sort of work because they, like you said, they were never part of it. So this is the generation that can truly, like, at a remove, start to can really parse it and really tear it down and break it. So maybe that's part of the reason why.
Maybe they just never, like they don't feel that the rules of that time apply to them. So it's something, again, that can be taken and appropriated and used in a way that, I don't know, that appropriation seems to just flow naturally now, that no one really questions, of course I'll appropriate that. Why wouldn't I? Because it's part of my
Because those were
way of
stupid
being.
rules.
They're stupid rules. Stupid.
Excuse me. It's a.
I don't think that it ever really applied in the same way in Winnipeg. The heroic model was never really part of the history
Right.
or presence in Winnipeg painting. So there was, there weren't the same kind of giants to knock down. The means and materials and the aspirations may always have been more modest and more immediate.
And yet the precision issue has definitely...
Precision, absolutely, but yes, that's true, and that is based or related to materials. Yes, but
There's been such technically brilliant artists from Winnipeg, and it's always like, what's in the water there sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. But the imagery doesn't seem to me to be typically modernist. So.
That does feel true. Absolutely. What did I just say? About Winnipeg? The question is, do you want to say?
Well, no, I think that that idea of technicality and I think that I hate to see kind of like a broad sweeping comments, but that idea about Canada just being about a technicality and a handcraft. I mean, it's different, very, very different everywhere, but I think that across the country, it is something that in one form or another does seem to reoccur over and over again. And I think we're seeing that here. You know, we're talking about Winnipeg, about that idea of hunkering down, but they do that in Saskatoon too. And there's artists like Tammy, as I was saying, someone like Dagmar Agenda or Zachary Logan, who again, Alison Norland, who are creating these epic...
But Alison's from Winnipeg too.
That's true, sorry. These epic drawings that are just... the product of an environment of having really nothing else to do. But I don't think to say that about the prairies is it's not unfair then to use it for somewhere like Toronto, who is still very you think of it as being a warmer place, but it's still subject to the same environmental disasters and I don't know.
After this. Yeah, well, yes, the entire country. After this past winter, I expect to see a lot of work from artists after this past winter, because I imagine everybody was holed up. I was, writing away most nights. So, but I do find it interesting because I guess Winnipeg does have a reputation for being a very, like, the artists from Winnipeg, I think especially, have a reputation for being very industrious and being very focused because, as you say, there's the idea that there's nothing else to do there. But I also get a sense that Winnipeg feels like a very collaborative
It's
city to me.
Yes, and there's a history of collective movements all the way back to the student Bolsheviks in the early 80s, and then, of course, the Royal Art Lodge. The Ladies of the Standard Movie House is a group of women who, while they were still in art school, produced environments and did performances in films and theater. And now there's a sort of a loosely formed but it's been operating for about 5 years, drawing club that inhabits restaurants and cafes. Ted Barker's part of that group, and they gather together and they draw. But one of the essential components is this rigor and critiquing. The peer critiquing is really key. If you can pass muster with your whoever's at your elbow, you can make it almost anywhere. And that applies to the production of the magazine. It applies to writing, to art making. It's a pretty critical, close-looking, and informed audience, even if it is cold.
So, and even just thinking of just different perspectives of different places in Canada. We feel like Vancouver owns photography in Canada. Montreal seems like the place where that owns painting. I don't know what you would. Toronto feels like it's maybe the market. I don't know what else you would call. I can't really think of how you would. I can't really think of like a Toronto movement. Can anybody think of like a Toronto movement? I can't really think of like an art movement that kind of came out of Toronto. Vancouver's.
You heard of the Group of Seven?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I have, but I don't know.
Or Painters 11.
So, but they were groups of artists. But they weren't like the Vancouver. We don't really have like a Toronto school. Like there's the Vancouver School of Photographers. There's like the Automatistes. They've been like it feels like they weren't labeled in any sort of way.
Maybe they were more competitive than collaborative.
Maybe I get that sense probably from the Painters 11 from what I've read. Yeah. But I'm just wondering whether I don't really feel like a genuine kind of movement like the Plasticiens or the Automatistes came out of Toronto, but perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps I need to go back and read some more, but I probably should. But
Well, I think maybe for me, if there's really a general point that can be made about art in Toronto over the sort of decades of modernism, postmodernism, and so on, it's not that there's a style, like a visually stylistic central avenue, but I think conceptually there's a tendency in Toronto. It's not a very narrow thing, but Toronto work sort of seems like Toronto work to me, coming from Montreal and coming from painting personally. There's a certain sort of attitude to painting here that's quite different in Toronto, and I think generally across contemporary art, I would characterize it, and I don't mean to be flip about it because it's a very involved thing, and I don't think it can be summed up in a few words. But there's a certain, the sort of general idea, and Michael Snow and some of the sort of major artists from Toronto that we know for many decades.
Bronson's from Winnipeg.
That is true, but and thank you. But could we call GI a Toronto phenomenon?
Okay.
At least for now. Okay, maybe it is.
A portion of general ideas.
I guess there's that sort of 60s structuralism, like a sort of conceptual through line there. I find that they all, and the very influential Toronto artists bequeath to the next generations. And I think it's still there. I mean, your point about formal-based work or process-based work being really kind of owned by younger female artists right now. I just finished an MFA in Guelph with Robert Enright, and I think that's really true. There's sort of incredibly technically strong work that sort of has been clearly modified from the high modern versions of it. It's got new sort of conceptual chops, and it's not intending itself to be seen only as a visual end product.
Yeah, Julia Dalt is an example of that. Julia Dalt is an example.
Yeah, absolutely, of course, yeah. But even at the student level, it's i.e. at the grassroots, it's very visible that. Anybody else want to ask any questions or say anything?
I want to thank you all. One of the extraordinary things, that because of what you all presented, is that one realizes that the legacy of modernism is so potent that it has to be negotiated. But what occurs in a lot of your presentations is it was a utopian movement, and the utopia obviously failed. So it ends up being a kind of end game to continue to use the tropes of an empty movement is ultimately going to have to run out of steam somewhere. And I wonder if any of you want to reflect on what, in fact, the future of the modernist project, which is being interrogated as an empty series of forms that are merely gestures towards something that didn't work. Will that ultimately run out of steam because it can't really go anywhere? I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, all the work that I see is remarkable, but there has to come a point, doesn't there, where we can't keep using modernism as the monster that didn't work to produce work that wants desperately to work out of the shadow of something that didn't work. You get my sense in that.
I get the sense that the future lies in the internet and internet-based work. And pardon me? I'm sorry, but I think that's what it's going to be.
It's where bite your tongue.
Yeah, it's telling me to bite my tongue. But I feel like that's where it's going to. I think that's probably where it's headed because
but on a
the younger
formal
generation.
Level, do you mean?
I think. Yeah,
so that art will migrate to the internet and.
So, well, I think when you're looking at, when you have somebody like, say somebody like Ryan Trey Carton being held up as the most important artist in North America right now. I think that is a real signal, is where that's where art is probably going to go. I think you're probably going to see a lot more, a lot more identity-based work maybe returning because we are living in a society in which, ourselves are reflected back at us so much, and I think some artists are maybe starting to negotiate that as well. I'm kind of from the air here, but those are two things that kind of immediately kind of strike me. I think you're probably going to see a lot more of, tech-based work. So yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting because
in a good way.
No, I don't know. I just think that idea of reinterpreting again is coming up again because then what you're seeing maybe is a bunch of people kind of going back to the 80s and 90s and like, oh, we haven't visited that in a while. Let's talk about that again.
Yes, exactly.
So, I don't know, it's a cycle.
Your kind of vaguely tie-dye type of shirt speaks the 80s to me.
Well,
sort of
it's
thing.
actually
So
early 90s.
It was
circa
early 90s
1993.
grunge. Early 90s grunge.
See, grunge is back.
Yes, grunge is back. Yes, that's true.
So I don't know. Like, it's kind of interesting that something that I always think about is just that idea of cycles and how, like, when is it going to be
Cycles.
Cycles.
Yeah.
Cycles.
Psychos. Yes.
Like,
Well,
when is new going to be new again, and when will it stop being just a reinterpretation or a melding of everything that's kind of.
Well, I think in culture in general, you know, it seems that people in their 20s set the pace of culture in general. And so whatever decade 20-somethings were born in, that's what you're going to see in the culture in general, and that's what they're going to be parsing, because I think that everybody, the decade in which you were born is always idealized, nostalgic. You didn't even live through it, but you're nostalgic for it. So I should be dressed like a dirty hippie, really, since I was born in like '68. But but I kind of feel like that's kind of, well, I did in my 20s. I was a total hippie in my 20s. There we go. But but I think that that's also too, like if you know, you could see a lot of like, you know, 80s, early 90s, you know, type of, what was the art like back then? I think you're seeing that in like, there's a young artist in Toronto, Hannah Herr, and if you look at her color palette is like all these like very Miami Vice like pastels, that sort of thing. So I think, you know, like you might see a return of that sort of thing too.
But that just kind of, it's an interesting question, because then is everything a return to something else?
Well, and also, I mean, if we just go back to Robert's question for a second about whether or not we're seeing the end of something sort of being end game to the point where at a certain point it has to stop. Is that, maybe Mika?
Will we see another movement that's as monolithic as modernism? I mean, these subsequent movements won't have the same impact or power or influence that something that is enormous as modernism, which covered every discipline, all aspects of our lives of life. There's really nothing to compete with it. I think we'll be responding to it and arguing back to it for a long time. It continues to resonate, and it was significant, and a lot of very important work came from that in literature, in architecture. Those were, you know, key areas.
I think that's I have to say, I think that's an extremely important point, because very often in visual arts conversation, when we use the word modernism, we're talking about New York formalism.
Yeah.
And and really it was a comprehensive culture that, you know, that is 50 or 60 years older than the Clement Greenberg school of thought about how flatness in painting is essential, or how medium specificity self-edits until it becomes a final version of itself. I mean, modernism is a vast world phenomenon, and I'm personally not sure whether it's fully over or not, but it does seem to be on its way out in some of its sort of more particular characteristics, like a subject, the way that subjectivity is the subject of very often for cultural production. That phenomena, I find, if anything, you know, I was born in the 70s, for example, and you know, I do find that with a talented artist now who's under 25, it's a bit different than it has been since I started looking at what art students were doing 15 years ago. There's been a kind of a similarity, and very, very slowly it's starting to be a bit different. Ryan Tricarden's a great example. That sort of carnivalesque, crazy expressionist video, that, you know, that's not something you would have seen in the 90s. Definitely not. Luke has a question.
Sorry, that's a little loud. We're talking about modernism specifically, and I think a lot of artists I'm interested personally, they do think about different time periods. So on a personal level, I'm really interested in Art Deco and how it gets translated in this 1980s way. It comes back in the 1980s and it's a strange translation of that movement. And then I try to mess it up a little bit more. I try to twist it and turn it. So somebody like John Raffman, like Bill, you mentioned the internet. And so John Raffman's work, it's digital, but I think that type of art historical referencing, so I wouldn't describe it as nostalgic, like I think the word nostalgic came up. So he uses like Agnes Martin, for example, and then coats a whole boardroom in Agnes Martin paintings. And there's an interesting tension that happens within that work where you get somebody who's really interested in somewhat formal abstraction and then this corporate boardroom, right? And this male-female thing. And so I think that in a lot of ways, the internet, there's a different type of way of referencing that's happening too. John Raffman's very irreverent about how he takes things and just grafts them onto stuff.
But is the irreverence the point, or is it sort of a side issue?
I think it's part of the work. I think it's the part of the way that he works in a lot of ways. And so his busts that have a famous painting wrapped around them, for example, I think that work wouldn't be made that way unless he was using the internet. So I think the internet, I like Bill's point. I think it's a part of the way that people are working. And I think it's a really interesting way that people are working too.
Thanks. John Raffman there's a photo over there in Antoine Tasquirand's booth where it's sort of early Mondrian, prior to his use of primary colors even, sort of 1912 or 13, along with the sort of Star Trek bridge, where you can see sort of Kirk's chair and it's sort of a Mondrian. It's pretty funny. Anybody else? Any further comment here? Have we? Let's go. We? Well, I guess thanks for coming, and yeah, have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, everybody.